Hi, I'm Steve Ballmer. I spent 34 years growing Microsoft, 10 years owning the LA Clippers basketball team. I love computers, data, and facts. That's why I started USA Facts, to help understand what our government is up to and what's going on in America. I'll share with you the facts and data, all from our government. You make up your own mind. In this episode of Just the Facts, America by the numbers. But first, a quick disclaimer. As I talk, I do a lot of rounding of numbers, but the data you see on screen will be more exact. Things might have changed since I recorded this in mid-June. I can't predict the future, but I'll be reading about it when it happens. So now, let's roll. The ancient Greeks said, "You must know thyself." So let's get to know this great country we call home. The United States of America is a vast country. At 3.8 million square miles, a square mile, by the way, is about 484 football fields all crammed together. We are the third largest country by area in the world. Behind whom? Russia, and guess who else? China, Brazil. No, the answer is actually our neighbors up north. Canada is the second largest country by area. Across our 3.8 million square miles, we have 4 million miles of roads, 63 national parks, and 37% of all land is owned by the government, federal, state, local. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, there were nearly 337 million people in the U.S. as of July 2024, which is 4% of the world's population, which is just over 8 billion. Now let's take a look at who we are. 22% of our country's population was 17 years old or younger. 36% were adults aged 18 to 44. 25% were 45 to 64 years old. And 18% of us were over 65. And I can say us. And just think, in 1980, seniors were 11.3% of our population and now account for 18%. Wow. And people under 18 were 28% back then, but now it's down to 22%. That's a huge change in the world of demographics. Kind of blows my mind. Meanwhile, the composition of U.S. households has also shifted. Married parent households have fallen from 31% of U.S. households in 1980 to just 18% in 2023. Wow, that is so different than from my childhood. At the same time, the share of households comprised of adults living alone without children increased from 23% to 29%. That's also a big change in the world of demographics. The percentage of married people with no kids at home has stayed relatively stable between 28 and 29%. Now, single-parent households with kids under 18 have also remained stable around 7.5%. There are now 10 million single-parent family households, 75% of which are single mothers and 25% are single fathers. However, in 1980, that dynamic was 90% single mothers and 10% single fathers. One fact that will likely ring true to many of you, 58% of men and 55% of women aged 18 to 24 lived in their parents' home in 2023. For men, that's actually a 6 percentage point increase since 1960, but the share of young women living at home is up 20 percentage points. Even more interesting is the 25 to 34-year-old age group, where 20% of men live with their parents, up from 11% in 1960, and 12% of women live with their parents, up from 7% in 1960. That's really interesting to me. Most of this growth has happened since 2008, and people are getting married later in life. The The U.S. Census Bureau found that the median age for marriage in 1980 was 22 for women and close to 25 for men. In 2023, it was 28 years old for women and 30 years old for men, another big demographic shift. Let's look at 6 different groups of people based upon Census Bureau data. First, let's look at people who identify as white but not Hispanic, about 195 million people. Then there are people who identify as white who also identify as Hispanic. That's over 56 million people. Black people who identify as non-Hispanic, 42 million people. And then black people who identify as Hispanic, 3.4 million people. Asians, 21 million people plus, and all other people in the U.S., close to 16 million. Here's a fun fact. To follow the overall trends of population changes between states, we can actually just look at the number of congresspeople assigned to each state and how that has changed over time. Currently, every congressional district includes approximately 760,000 people. Since 1980, the biggest winners or growers, if you will, have been states like Texas, with an increase of 11 members of Congress. The biggest losers, relatively in population, are states like New York, who lost 8 congresspeople. Looks like a lot of people have decided they prefer warm weather and sunshine. Not me. I'll stick with Seattle. Now let's take a look at education. In 2022, among those 25 or older, 9% had less than a high school diploma or equivalent. 28% of people had high school graduate as their highest level of school completed. 15% of people had completed some college, but not a degree. 10% had an associate degree. 23% had a bachelor's degree. 14% had actually completed an advanced degree, such as a master's, a professional certification, or a doctoral degree. In 1980, 17% of the population 25 years or older had completed at least 4 years of college. In 2022, 38%. That's a big increase from my perspective. Since 1993, 24% of people who identify as white but not Hispanic had 4 years of college or more. By 2022, that rose to 42%. For blacks, it went from 12% to nearly 28%. And for Hispanics, people who identified black or white as Hispanics, it went from 9% to 21%. And Asians are now at 59%. In 2023, more women had a college degree than men, 39.7 to 36.9%, so it's close. But in 1980, men had a 7.3 percentage point advantage, 20.9% compared to 13.6%. Let's talk about how our kids are doing in school. Between 1990 and 2022, math proficiency increased from 15% to 26% among 8th graders and from 13% to 36% among 4th graders. I love the improvement. I think the scores are overall lower than at least I would hope for as a citizen. Reading proficiency began being measured in 1992 and has barely increased at all, from just over 29% to 31% for 8th graders and 29% to 33% among 4th graders. All test scores peaked between 2013 and 2017 and have declined some since. For example, 4th grade math proficiency peaked at 42% in 2013, but now we see it at 36%. To me, that's the wrong direction. Here's my view. As a nation, it just isn't acceptable where we are, and there are a lot of factors that go into these scores, not just what goes on in the classroom. But we need to do better. Let's take a bit of a look at what Americans do for a living. First of all, reference: 161 million Americans are working. In 2022, there were 20.9 million people working for our government. 79% worked for state and local government, and 21% worked for the federal government. I'm sure it won't surprise you that more Americans are working from home post-pandemic than pre-pandemic. In 2019, 6% of Americans worked from home. In 2022, that number was 15%. For those who still commute to work, the average commute time is 26 minutes. 3% only take public transportation to work, while 69% of people drove alone. 92% of households in the U.S. had at least one car available to them in 2022. Actually, 37% had access to 2 cars, and 22% had access to 3 or more. Let's talk about technology. In 2023, 96% of U.S. households had at least one type of computer, and 92% had a broadband internet subscription. Smartphones were the most common computing device in U.S. households. Of course. 92% of households have at least one, followed by 80% of households who have one or more desktop or laptop computers, and 64% with tablet. Here's a fun fact. Americans gamble. We spent approximately $98 billion on lottery tickets in 2022. I found this surprising. Massachusetts residents spend the most at $970 per capita, while North Dakota residents spent the least, just $37. How about a little lightning round of other interesting facts about America? 1. 16 million veterans in the country. 2. 1.3 million active duty soldiers. 3. 67 million people on Medicare, while there's 75 million people on Medicaid. 42 million people relied on food stamps as of 2023. 38 million people, unfortunately, were below the poverty line in 2022. 70 million people received Social Security. Our life expectancy is about 77.5 years for someone born today, but the average age of death is 73 years. 1.2 million people were in prison in 2022. That doesn't include people who were in jail, typically for periods under a year. America has 880 million acres of farmland. That's the size of Texas times 5. In 2022, corn was our number one cash crop, followed by soybeans, fruits, and nuts. After oil and gas, civilian aircrafts and parts are the country's biggest export. Our biggest export specifically to China? Soybeans. And finally, a word on our democracy. The 2020 presidential election had the highest voter turnout of the 21st century, with 66.8% of citizens over 18 voting in the election. That's great. As with past elections, a higher share of women than men turned out to vote. 68.4% of women, 65% of men. Voter turnout also increased as age, educational attainment, and income increased. Voter turnout was highest among those ages 65 to 74 at 76%, while the percentage was lowest among those aged 18 to 24 at 51%. It's sure going to be interesting to see what those numbers look like this election cycle. I've learned a lot from this. I hope you have too. I hope you agree. The more we know, the better voters we can be. We give you just the facts. You decide what you believe.